run out of chances. How many days can you stay there and not get killed?
You just have to take it as it comes. And if you're strong enough to stand it, you can stand it. If you're not strong enough, you're going to crack.
February 19th, 1945, 08:59. The United States Marine Corps reaches the beach of Iwo Jima and, during the first half hour, encounters no fire. This is not a defensive failure. It is the order of Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi to saturate the beach with troops before opening coordinated fire from concealed positions. The island covers 20 square kilometers and controls the route of B-29 bombers between the Marianas and Japan. After its capture, 2,251 emergency landings will be recorded, proof of its operational value. The opposing sides arrive with contrasting plans. The United States relies on naval bombardment and marine divisions to seize the airfields. Japan abandons frontal confrontation and fights underground, more than 18 kilometers of tunnels, over 1,500 bunkers at a depth of 20 meters. Today, 80 years later, the imprint of 20,000 soldiers remains within the island's tunnel network. Control of the island was never absolute. Beneath the basalt, sealed chambers still remain, guarding their final load of honor and gunpowder. What made this island an indispensable objective for both sides? Why did that initial silence prove more lethal than a bombardment? Why was Iwo Jima so important to the United States and Japan? In 1945, Iwo Jima occupied 20 square kilometers of rock and volcanic ash in the middle of the Western Pacific. The ground was a mixture of solidified lava and volcanic sand. Under the heat, the island expelled gases and steam from cracks and vents, reminding everyone at every step that the terrain was still geologically active. Its true value lay on the map. Iwo Jima is located 1,220 kilometers southeast of Tokyo, directly beneath the most direct flight line between the Marianas and the Japanese archipelago. For the B-29 superfortresses departing from bases such as Saipan or Tinian, that position turned the island into a fixed point within an air war that depended on repeated routes and minute-by-minute calculations. For Japan, Iwo Jima functioned as a forward warning outpost. Observation, tracking, and alerts that arrived before bomber formations reached the main islands. The logic was simple and lethal. The earlier a wave of bombers was detected, the sooner anti-aircraft defenses could be activated and interception efforts reorganized. The island alone did not stop the offensive. It reduced the margin of surprise with every transmitted warning. For the United States, capturing Iwo Jima meant cutting that system and seizing its airfields as a platform of its own. During the war, 2,251 B-29 landings were recorded on the island. Many were due to fuel shortages, mechanical failures, or immediate operational necessity, while others responded to less critical uses. But the strategic effect was the same. A runway halfway could decide whether an aircraft returned home or disappeared into the ocean. Geography turned every meter into a force multiplier. To the south rose Mount Suribachi, a 169-meter volcano that visually dominated the beaches planned for the landing and the corridors of advance toward the interior. On a short, narrow island, that height was not a detail. It was a natural observation post to adjust fire and monitor any concentration of troops attempting to consolidate on the coast. Beyond Suribachi, the rest of Iwo Jima offered an irregular board of ridges, depressions, and steps of hardened lava, cut by areas of extremely loose black sand. That sand did not give way. It swallowed boots, slowed movement, and complicated the use of vehicles from the very first minute. The island forced a slow advance, bodies sinking into the ground precisely where a prepared defense could turn every pause into an opportunity to pin the enemy under fire. Added to the difficulty of the terrain was an unexpected medical factor, the very nature of the black sand. Being volcanic ash, it was extremely abrasive and porous, causing any wound, no matter how small, to become instantly contaminated with bacteria trapped in the sulfurous soil. Iwo Jima thus became a testing ground for the most advanced combat medicine of the time. It was here that the mass use of penicillin and blood plasma directly on the shoreline determined the survival of thousands of men. Navy medics, known as corpsmen, operated under mortar fire, performing transfusions while sinking into the shifting sand. Medical logistics had to be as aggressive as military logistics. Field hospitals were established that were little more than holes in the sand, protected by bags. where success was measured by the speed with which volcanic ash could be cleared from the lungs and veins of the wounded before gas-related infections became lethal. That slow advance over black sand was only the surface layer. Beneath it, Iwo Jima concealed the real fight, a defense carved into volcanic rock designed to survive pre-invasion bombardment and to deny attackers the most dangerous confirmation of all, the belief that a target had already been neutralized. The turning point came in June 1944. The Imperial Army placed the island under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the 109th Division, with orders signed on June 8, 1944. Kuribayashi landed on Iwo Jima on June 19, 1944, and personally surveyed the terrain before dictating a change in defensive doctrine. He had lived in the United States as a military attaché and knew from direct experience the industrial and logistical scale of the enemy he was facing. His mission was clear: hold the island for as long as possible, even assuming it could not be held indefinitely. For that reason, he broke with what the Marines expected in the Pacific. He banned large-scale banzai charges and avoided frontal confrontation as an automatic response. Instead of winning the beach, he planned a battle of attrition, concealed positions, crossfire, and layered defensive lines that would force every advance to be paid for in time and casualties. To make that plan viable, he ordered the island to be transformed into a connected underground infrastructure. These were not isolated caves. It was a system that allowed movement, resupply, and reappearance without exposure to observation or naval fire. Entrances were camouflaged, and multiple exits opened new angles over the same ground the attacker believed to be under control. The work was carried out under conditions that punished the defender himself. Subsurface heat and sulfurous gases made life difficult in the excavated positions. Ventilation was limited, and the work was done over months in an environment that seemed to expel steam from the earth itself. On Iwo Jima, even remaining still inside a hole could become an operational problem. When the landing began, the network was already a functional labyrinth. More than 18 kilometers of completed tunnels connected shelters, machine gun nests, observation posts, and command positions. Contemporary estimates raise the total to nearly 26 kilometers of galleries and more than 1,500 bunkers distributed across the island. In critical sectors, the north and the slopes of Kuribayashi, that connectivity allowed men and weapons to be redistributed while the surface absorbed continuous fire. Thus, the island that from above appeared to be an obstacle to bodies and vehicles had been transformed underground into a mechanism of prolonged resistance. Each position captured on the surface did not close the fight. It opened another firing line, another hidden opening, another route through which the defender could reappear where no one was yet looking. The Marines landed on Iwo Jima with a promise in their ears: 5 days. The United States High Command was so confident in the power of its 14,000 tons of steel that they believed the battle would be a simple clearing operation. After 3 days of relentless bombardment from the sea, the island appeared to be a pile of inert ash. The logic was indisputable. Nothing could have survived that inferno. But when they set foot on the black sand, the promise of 5 days sank with them. The first impact was not fire, but silence. An unnatural silence that unsettled the first waves. The Marines advanced through a lunar landscape of shattered lava and craters, desperately searching for an enemy to look in the eye. They expected the classic suicidal banzai charge, the shout of thousands of men running toward their machine guns to die in the open. But no one appeared. What they did not know was that beneath their boots, 20,000 men were watching them through invisible cracks. Kuribayashi had rewritten the rules of war. He was not going to waste their lives on the surface. He had turned his army into an invisible subterranean force. This is where the real operational crisis began. The Marines would clear a bunker with flamethrowers, watch the flames consume the interior, and then move on. Minutes later, those same men would take fire from behind, from the very position they had just burned. This was not a mistake by the soldiers, it was the nervous system of the island. While the Americans fought for every meter of ash, the defenders moved through 18 kilometers of tunnels, reappearing in dead positions as if the ground itself had reorganized. Kuribayashi had not built simple shelters. He had designed a structure of sacrifice intended to delay the clock of history. From his command post 20 meters underground, the Japanese general coordinated a defense that did not need to see the light of day to be lethal. Ironically, the American bombardment became the defense's greatest ally. Every new crater was a perfect machine gun nest, every collapsed building a better camouflaged hideout. Naval punishment had not cleared the way. It had only created the ideal labyrinth for Kuribayashi to execute his plan. Allow the enemy to advance far enough that any attempt to withdraw would become a massacre. Faced with an enemy that refused to reveal itself, the Americans were forced to abandon conventional military tactics and embrace the brutality of chemical engineering. Enter the Sherman Zippo, a variant of the Sherman tank that replaced its main gun with a high-pressure flamethrower capable of projecting streams of liquid fire over distances of more than 100 meters. But the true horror did not unfold in the open. It occurred when the fire met the mouths of the tunnels. Combat engineers began applying what they called cave treatment. They injected thousands of liters of a mixture of fuel and napalm directly into the vents and entrances of the galleries, followed by a single demolition charge or a white phosphorus grenade. The goal was not only to burn the defender, but to instantly consume all available oxygen in the lower levels. Those who did not die burned by the flames died from the absolute vacuum in their lungs, trapped in chambers that, within seconds, were transformed into sealed crematory furnaces beneath tons of incandescent volcanic rock. On February 19, 1945, at 8:59, the first wave of Marines set foot on the southeastern coast of Iwo Jima and encountered something that did not fit any prior Pacific experience. For roughly 30 minutes, the defense did not detonate on the beach. There were scattered shots and occasional mortar dispersed noise, but not the wall of fire everyone expected. That void reassured no one. It made every decision more dangerous by forcing the advance without knowing what was being prepared. That silence had an author and a purpose. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to hold their fire until the landing zones were congested, literally packed with men and equipment. He was not trying to stop the first foot on the sand. He wanted more to come in, more to accumulate, until the space itself became a physical trap. The volcanic sand gives way under the weight. Boots sink, movement slows, lines bunch together. On that ground, moving fast is difficult, and finding immediate cover is almost impossible, precisely when it is needed most. The scene thickens, shouted signals, men trying to orient themselves, units searching for places to deploy as the space narrows through the sheer friction of the terrain. Then the island ignited. For months, Japanese artillerymen had calculated every coordinate of the beach. They did not need to see in order to kill, they only needed to fire. The 320mm shells, the largest in the Japanese arsenal, fell from the sky like meteorites, turning the beach into a grinder. As the day wore on, frustration turned into terror. American squads applied the classic doctrine: locate the bunker, pin it down with machine guns, and destroy it with flamethrowers. It worked, or so they believed. But while the Marines celebrated the clearing of a position, the defenders slipped through ventilation tunnels to lower levels, reappearing minutes later in the American rear. But the true descent into hell came at nightfall. Kuribayashi was the first Japanese commander to officially forbid the banzai charge. He knew that a suicidal assault was a gift to Marine machine guns. Instead, he imposed what he called infiltration warfare. As the sun went down, small groups of defenders, nicknamed shadow hunters, emerged from hidden trapdoors among the bodies on the beach. They slipped into the foxholes. Kuribayashi's order was clear. Each man must kill 10 Americans before he dies. The Marines were not conquering the island. They were being devoured by it, centimeter by centimeter, under the weight of an enemy that never surrendered because it already considered itself dead. Yet long before the first Marine ever peered into a tunnel, the Japanese garrison was already fighting a desperate battle against its own biology. Iwo Jima is a geographical anomaly, a volcanic island without a single natural source of fresh water. Kuribayashi had ordered rainwater to be collected in concrete cisterns, but naval bombardment in the early days pulverized almost all of them. Underground, reality was a constant torture. The volcano's geothermal heat pushed tunnel temperatures above 40 or 45 degrees Celsius, loading the air with an unbearable stench of sulfur and decay. Japanese soldiers, their lips cracked and their throats burned raw, resorted to chewing their own lead identification tags or smooth volcanic stones in an attempt to trick their salivary glands. Dysentery and dehydration ravaged them in the darkness, turning every movement into an agonizing effort. For many of these men, the final act of combat was not an ideological choice, but the end of a physical agony the surface could not even imagine. Suicide was, in many cases, the only way to escape a thirst that was consuming their judgment. The descent underground. With the advance stalled, American commanders grasped a decisive operational reality. They were not fighting only Japanese forces, but the island itself. As long as the underground defense remained intact, control of the surface would always be provisional. Taking Iwo Jima meant neutralizing what lay beneath it. The first response was to avoid direct entry. Units tried to seal the enemy in, not pursue him. Bulldozers pushed rock and volcanic sand over identified cave mouths. Combat engineers placed charges to collapse access points. Specialized teams used flamethrowers to saturate cavities without exposing themselves to close-quarters fighting. The objective was simple: deny the use of the tunnels without having to occupy them. That approach came at an immediate cost. Flamethrower operators became priority targets because their weapon was one of the few capable of quickly neutralizing underground positions. Every time they advanced toward an entrance, they drew concentrated fire from concealed positions. Even so, units continued to deploy them because sealing the tunnels seemed the only way to reduce the constant pressure on the lines. The problem was structural. The underground network did not function as a collection of independent caves, but as an interconnected system. Sealing one entrance did not isolate a position. It simply diverted internal movement to another exit. In multiple sectors, after a sealing or saturation operation, Japanese fire reappeared minutes later from a different opening, 40 or 50 meters from the original point. The defense absorbed the blow and redistributed itself. As the days passed, that evidence forced a decision no one wanted to make. To dismantle the network, they had to enter it. Small teams were organized to advance through narrow passages, often wide enough for only one man. They were armed with pistols, flashlights, and light charges, moving slowly through an environment where every bend could conceal a defensive position. Some tunnels stretched for dozens of meters with no lighting or adequate ventilation. Others opened into large chambers carved into volcanic rock. Heat retained by the basalt steadily raised the temperature. The air was thick, and progress required frequent pauses. Every step carried immediate risk, not because of what was visible, but because of what could be triggered from any point in the system. Descending underground transformed the battle into a series of fragmented engagements, with no clear lines and no direct support. The fight for Iwo Jima ceased to be a conquest of visible positions and became a slow process of neutralization, meter by meter, of a buried fortress that continued to operate even when the surface appeared momentarily to be in American hands. Facing an enemy that could be beneath their feet without being seen, the Marines turned to an ally technology could not replicate: animal scent. The 7th War Dog Platoon, composed mainly of Dobermans and German Shepherds, became vital to survival on the surface. These dogs, trained for absolute silence, did not bark. They alerted their handlers through subtle changes in posture or the bristling of their fur. Their targets were ventilation trapdoors invisible to the human eye, hidden beneath layers of ash or artillery debris. The dogs detected the smell of sweat, Japanese tobacco, or cooked food rising from tunnels meters below the surface. Without these silent hunters, American patrols would have continued to fall victim to ambushes from behind indefinitely. Japanese defenders came to fear these animals so much that they offered rewards and issued priority orders to kill the dogs and their handlers before targeting any infantry officer. The military architecture beneath Iwo Jima. When the Marines truly began entering the underground, what they found was not a chain of scattered caves, but an infrastructure planned like a buried headquarters. Kuribayashi had organized his defense so that command, communications, and resupply would continue to function even if the surface was turned into a field of craters. His main command post was installed in the northern part of the island, near the northeastern area of Kita, excavated 20 meters underground. The complex included a war room and concrete chambers for his staff, designed to maintain coordination while naval and aerial fire pounded the surface without pause. At very short distance, the Japanese had built a communications center on a scale unusual for Pacific Islands, a 50-meter-long underground chamber accessible through a 150-meter tunnel. This detail is crucial because it explains why, for days, the Americans could silence one sector and still receive coordinated fire from another. The island had a core that continued transmitting and reallocating effort. The network was not homogeneous, it was sectorized by function. On Hill 382, one of the dominant elevations in the north, a radio and meteorological station was installed, and nearby a large blockhouse was built that served as the headquarters of Chosaku Kaido, the colonel responsible for artillery on the island. Kuribayashi also attempted an even more ambitious project, an underground corridor linking the main defensive installations with a planned length of nearly 27 kilometers. It was never completed, but by the time of the landing, more than 18 kilometers had already been excavated, enough to move entire sections without direct exposure. The design also included a component that from above was almost invisible. Japanese tanks buried or embedded as pillboxes with turrets and hulls integrated into the volcanic terrain to function as fixed firing points. This reuse turned armored vehicles into machine gun and gun positions that were not easily identified from the air or from the beach. In practice, this underground architecture pushed the Marines into a type of combat decided not along a continuous front, but at nodes of the system. Entrances, chambers, intersections, and exits that connected to the major positions in the north. Here emerged the tactical geography that would define the rest of the battle. The Motoyama Plateau sector, and within it, the cluster of strong points the Marines themselves would come to call the meat grinder. Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and the amphitheater, a triangle of mutually supporting positions. To the west, the problem was parallel. The heights of Hill 362, with its ridges and counter-ridges, sustained fields of fire that required repeated assaults and systematic reduction. In the final phase, the advance of the 5th Division into broken ground, known as the Gorge and Death Valley, resulted in 9 days of cave-by-cave reduction, with constant use of demolition charges and direct fire to close fortifications that had survived earlier bombardment. The value of Iwo Jima went beyond the asphalt of its runways. The island was the electronic eye and nerve center of the Empire's early warning network. In 1945, Japan could not compete in aircraft numbers, so its survival depended on early detection. Iwo Jima was part of a chain of radar and listening stations using Type 13 and Type 21 radar models, capable of tracking metallic echoes hundreds of kilometers out over the sea. As B-29 superfortresses climbed out from the Marianas, operators on nearby Chichijima picked up the initial signals. But it was Iwo Jima that refined the telemetry. Hidden in bunkers reinforced with double layers of concrete and buried 20 meters underground to withstand direct hits from 16-inch shells, Japanese radio operators worked under conditions of absolute discipline. They transmitted in real time using high-frequency radio waves that bounced off the ionosphere to reach the defense headquarters in Tokyo directly. They did not send position alone. They reported formation, precise altitude, and, most critically, the attack vector. This flow of data gave Tokyo up to 120 minutes of advance warning. That time was an incalculable tactical advantage. It allowed selective blackouts at armaments factories to prevent industrial glow from guiding American navigators. It also allowed interceptor fighters, such as the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, to gain the altitude needed to attack the heavy B-29s from above, their most vulnerable angle. For strategists in the United States Army Air Forces, Iwo Jima was an electrical thorn that had to be torn out. As long as the island remained operational, the element of surprise in Curtis LeMay's night attacks was nullified. By capturing Mount Suribachi and silencing its antennas, the United States gained not only an airfield but stripped the empire of its most precious resource, reaction time. Without Iwo Jima, B-29 formations went from being detectable threats to becoming ghosts that appeared over Tokyo without warning, collapsing Japan's anti-aircraft defense. As the days turned into weeks, the fight on Iwo Jima evolved into a technological and artisanal duel between the engineers of both sides, a war of countermeasures in which every advance was met with a desperate innovation. Japanese sappers, aware that their bunkers were detected by muzzle flash or gun smoke, developed deflected firing systems. They used periscopes and mirrors to aim their weapons from impossible angles, keeping both the barrel and the gunner completely protected beneath layers of concrete. They even designed ventilation systems that vented gun smoke dozens of meters away from the true position, creating artillery ghosts that the Americans bombarded in vain. The Marines responded by creating selective demolition units. Faced with the impossibility of blowing apart reinforced concrete bunkers more than a meter thick with conventional explosives, American engineers began using shaped charges, a technology designed to focus the full energy of the blast onto a single point, punching through armor as if with a thermal torch. But the most rudimentary and lethal innovation was the use of cable and hook rigs. Marines threw anchors attached to tanks to literally tear away the steel plates protecting Japanese embrasures, exposing the interior to flamethrower fire. Iwo Jima was not only a clash of wills, it was a bloody laboratory where military engineering was pushed to its absolute limit to solve a problem naval artillery had been unable to resolve: how to kill an enemy who had turned geology itself into armor. The War of Words, the Nisei interpreters. As charges demolished entrances and flamethrowers sealed chambers, a completely different form of combat emerged. It was not fought with explosives, but with voices. In several sectors of Iwo Jima, before destroying a cave, American commanders turned to Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans serving in the military intelligence service. Their task was to attempt the improbable, to convince defenders trapped underground to come out alive. These men were not improvised. Many had been recruited at Camp Savage in Minnesota and Fort Snelling, where the Army trained more than 6,000 Nisei in translation, interrogation, and psychological warfare over the course of the war. On Iwo Jima, they operated in small teams, advancing to tunnel mouths with minimal cover, often in areas still under indirect fire. From outside, they spoke through megaphones directly into the darkness. The message was carefully calculated. It contained no threats and no orders. It appealed to everyday familiar elements: food, home, parents, wives. They explained again and again that prisoners received medical care, water and food, that they would not be mistreated, that surrender did not mean immediate punishment or automatic reprisals against their families. Each sentence was designed to dismantle years of imperial indoctrination that portrayed capture as a fate worse than death. The psychological effect was intense but rarely immediate. Inside the tunnels, defenders faced an absolute dilemma. On one side, the external voice spoke in their native language with a familiar accent, using cultural references impossible to fake. On the other, the internalized discipline remained: surrender as irreversible dishonor, instilled by officers, manuals, and years of instruction. The decision was not tactical, it was existential. In some cases, the silence stretched on for entire minutes. In others, the response was abrupt and final, internal detonations signaling self-inflicted death before capture could occur. The Nisei quickly learned to interpret those sounds as an irreversible failure of the attempt, and also as a warning that immediate access had become extremely dangerous. Even so, the efforts were not in vain. On Iwo Jima, more than 1,000 Japanese defenders were ultimately captured alive, an extraordinary figure for a Pacific battle. A significant portion of those captures was linked to direct negotiations inside caves, many of them facilitated by Nisei interpreters who managed to convince wounded, unconscious, or isolated soldiers that emerging did not equate to immediate execution. The personal risk was immense. These translators deliberately placed themselves on the front line, often just meters from unsecured tunnel mouths, knowing that any mistake could trigger an internal explosion or sudden fire from the darkness. For the Nisei themselves, the experience carried an additional weight. Many were speaking to men who, culturally, could have been their fathers or brothers. Some knew that while they served in the United States Army, their own families remained interned in camps within the United States. Each surrender achieved was not only a tactical victory, it was a personal affirmation that life could prevail, however marginally, over the logic of absolute sacrifice. In most tunnels, however, the final response was not a silhouette emerging into the light, but a silence sealed forever beneath volcanic rock. The war of words rarely defeated the war of convictions. But where a soldier did emerge, trembling and blinded by the sun after weeks in darkness, it proved that even on Iwo Jima, an island designed to resist to the very end, there were moments when the human voice succeeded in opening a crack where bombs could not. As the sun went down, the battle left the realm of sight and became an auditory experience that shattered nerves. Marines trying to rest in their trenches reported a terrifying sensation: the sound of distant voices, metallic knocks, or the scrape of equipment against rock that seemed to come from directly beneath their bodies. The proximity between the two armies was so extreme that ventilation tunnels became conduits of paranoia. The Japanese exploited these echoes to wage relentless psychological warfare. They whispered insults in broken English from the shadows or emerged in absolute silence in the middle of the night to drag a sentry into a spider hole before he could scream. Blind firefights erupted, with men shooting at shadows guided only by the sound of breathing or the crunch of sand. On Iwo Jima, the front line was not kilometers away behind a line of trenches. It was barely 30 centimeters beneath American boots, listening to every movement and waiting for the moment of absolute silence to strike from the bowels of the earth. As the weeks passed, the Japanese defense on Iwo Jima ceased to function as a coherent system and fragmented into isolated underground pockets. Tunnels that initially allowed movement and redistribution were severed by collapses, explosions, and deliberate sealing. Many surviving defenders were trapped in chambers with no exits, cut off from other units, with rations exhausted and access to water increasingly scarce, while American forces closed the noose from above and below. At that point, the battle entered its terminal phase. For most Japanese soldiers, no real military option remained. Surrender was formally prohibited by Imperial Army doctrine, portrayed as a dishonor that extended beyond the individual to stain the family. The acceptable alternative, instilled over years, was to die in the fulfillment of duty. As a result, the final resistance did not manifest in major engagements, but in extreme decisions taken in the darkness. Marines reducing the last sectors encountered a recurring pattern. In sealed chambers, bodies were found clustered beside empty ration tins and dry canteens, evidence of men who had held out until their last reserves were consumed. In other spaces, defenders had caused self-inflicted deaths with explosives, leaving blackened walls and collapsed galleries. Collective endings carried out with bladed weapons were also documented, following traditional codes of military honor. These were not impulsive acts, but deliberate closures once all possibility of continuation had vanished. The scale of this outcome was exceptional. Of a Japanese garrison of just over 21,000 men, 1,000 were captured alive during the battle. The vast majority died fighting, or were buried in caves and tunnels that were never reopened, transformed into permanent graves beneath volcanic rock. This context profoundly altered the American combat experience. In time, many Marines admitted that absolute silence was more unsettling than enemy fire. The fate of the Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was enveloped in that same ambiguity. His body was never conclusively identified despite exhaustive searches. Some testimonies place his death during a final attack launched in the last days of March 1945. Others locate him in an underground command post where he is believed to have died alongside his staff. The only confirmed fact is that after his last known message, he gave no further sign of life, and his exact end remains one of the enduring questions of the battle. For the Americans, what was most disturbing about these discoveries was not only death itself, but the ideological conviction that sustained it. Many defenders died, convinced they were protecting their homeland and their families, persuaded that capture meant torture, humiliation, and an eternal stain on their lineage. That belief, reinforced by years of propaganda and military discipline, turned the final phase of Iwo Jima into something more than an armed confrontation. When the Marines entered the final chambers, they did not witness only the remains of a battle. They witnessed the extreme outcome of an ideology that placed honor above individual survival. The night of March 25, 1945, marked the dramatic climax of that resistance. According to reports, General Kuribayashi, aware that the end was inevitable, carried out an act that broke with every tradition of senior command. He removed his rank insignia, set aside his decorations, and personally led the last 300 fighters in a final assault against the American camp of airmen and Marines near Airfield No. 2. It was not a chaotic banzai charge. It was a technical, silent, and lethal infiltration that lasted until dawn. In the confusion of close-quarters combat, Kuribayashi vanished. Without insignia to identify him, his body was never recognized among the mass of corpses disfigured by the fighting. This final decision fed the myth that the general never truly died, or that the island he himself had transformed into a fortress ultimately chose to swallow him forever, denying the victor the trophy of his capture or the certainty of his grave. The underground legacy and the final echoes. When the battle officially ended on March 26, 1945, the surface of Iwo Jima was under United States control, but the underground did not surrender with the same clarity. The tunnels, designed to endure even after the loss of visible ground, remained an ambiguous, inaccessible, and dangerous space. For weeks after the declared end of the campaign, American units stationed on the island continued to register activity. Sounds coming from sealed galleries, smoke seeping through volcanic cracks, and unmistakable signs of human presence underground. These were not perceptions or lingering effects of combat. Small groups of Japanese soldiers had survived in deep chambers that were never located during the systematic reduction. There they subsisted on pre-existing supplies, rainwater collection, and extreme rationing discipline. Many waited for orders that would never arrive, or for a victory that was already impossible. Informational isolation was total. For them, the war had not ended. The so-called holdouts were not an anecdotal rarity. On Iwo Jima, cases of prolonged resistance were documented for years. The last two known defenders, Kofuku Yamakage and Rikio Matsudo, did not surrender until January 6, 1949, nearly 4 years after Japan's official surrender. When they emerged, they were physically weakened and profoundly disoriented, still convinced that the conflict was ongoing. Their case confirmed the extent to which the underground system had allowed not only continued combat, but survival outside historical time. This phenomenon shaped a particular memory among the combatants. Many Marines admitted years later that the island's silence was more unsettling than enemy fire. A silent tunnel could indicate hidden life, latent resistance, or a deliberate closure with explosives. The uncertainty never fully disappeared. Even after the war, Iwo Jima retained a singular reputation, not as an abandoned battlefield, but as a place where the war seemed to have become trapped underground. Decades later, American veterans who returned for commemorative ceremonies described intense physical reactions when approaching sealed tunnel entrances. Some deliberately avoided those areas, fully aware of what they had seen inside. For many, Iwo Jima was not merely a past experience, but a permanent reference point. Any enclosed space, any descent underground, reactivated memories tied to darkness, silence, and invisible threat. Japanese survivors who eventually recounted their experiences offered a parallel perspective. Far removed from any notion of glory, they described the underground as an environment of absolute attrition, constant heat, extreme thirst, prolonged fear, and a weight that seemed endless. Yet they also recalled decisive moments when Japanese-American interpreters approached cave entrances unarmed, speaking in Japanese to explain that surrender did not mean execution. In several cases, those efforts saved lives that would otherwise have remained buried in the rock. Today, nearly 80 years later, the tunnels are still there. Many access points have collapsed due to erosion and seismic activity. Others remain sealed for safety reasons. Exploration is extremely limited because of unexploded ordnance and structural instability. Even so, military historians agree that kilometers of galleries remain intact beneath the island, containing rusted weapons, human remains, and chambers never documented. Japanese recovery teams continue to work on the island. Over the decades, thousands of remains have been recovered and repatriated, but it is estimated that up to 10,000 Japanese soldiers are still buried in collapsed chambers without precise location. At known entrances, symbolic offerings, water, sake, are left in memory of those who died trapped underground. The island has no permanent civilian population. Access is restricted to military personnel and commemorative events. Iwo Jima has become a space of shared memory, marked by restraint and respect. The body of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was never found. His personal effects may still be buried somewhere within the underground system he himself ordered to be built. A systematic search is unfeasible. The risk outweighs the archaeological value. The tunnels of Iwo Jima are not merely remnants of military engineering. They are the physical testimony of a war pushed beyond any reasonable limit. They represent what happens when an ideology turns death into duty and surrender into absolute negation. For those who fought there in 1945, the underground was not just another setting. It was a place one never truly leaves. And that is why even today, beneath the black volcanic sand, the labyrinth remains silent, heavy with memory, waiting without moving, as if the war had never fully ended.